Now that we have an idea of what bonds are about, especially covalent bonds, let's look at the structures that these bonded elements can actually make. For example, we had seen methane before, and methane is represented as CH4. That's the molecular formula. And we had also looked at ammonia's, NH3, water, H2O, and you can also have oxygen. If you look at molecular oxygen, the oxygen in the atmosphere is O2. Now we can represent these structures, these objects, in not just molecular formulas, but what's also called a structural formula, and that's where you draw lines that represent the covalent bonds that connect them together. Now when we draw lines between these elemental symbols, we're really representing covalent bonds. Other types of bonds, like ionic bonds, and there are some others which I'll introduce here shortly, are drawn differently. So whenever you see a line like this, you can interpret that as a covalent bond. Notice then that each line represents a shared pair of electrons going around the nuclei, not between them. Okay, so we can see a CH4 methane like this, NH3 like this, and water like this. And notice the molecular oxygen has to have a double bond because each oxygen has to have two bonds. We can also represent these in other forms as well, ball and stick molecules, as if literally we're taking these sorts of like wooden balls that represent the different elements with sticks in them that are connected together. And notice then the black represents carbon. It has 4 sticks attached to it because it can form 4 covalent bonds. Each white one is a hydrogen because it's just going to be able to have 1 stick attached to it. The blue is nitrogen. It has 3. The red is oxygen. By the way, those are fairly conventional. Whenever you buy a molecular model kit, those are typically the colors that they use. And then we can do this. Now the space filling model, you'll note, is similar to the ball and stick model, but it's more like, not exactly, but it's more like what we actually would see if we could see the molecules that small, and that made sense. It really actually doesn't because we can't see things that small in that way. But it would have this kind of property. So methane would actually look like this. So here's the way I want you to think about it. When we draw the molecular formula or the structural formula, I want you to see this in your head, the actual space filling model, because that's a better representation of what it's like in three-dimensional space. Now, all of these things right here, these things that we've made here, are what are referred to as molecules. Molecules are different than elements. An element is, or an atom I should say, is a single smallest unit that's electrically neutral of a particular element or elementary substance. A molecule is similar except that it has to have more than one atom attached together. Okay, so a molecule, by the definition in your textbook, is the smallest electrically neutral structural unit of an element or a compound. By structural unit, what we mean is this object right here is a structure. It's that. That's a structural unit of an element or a compound. Now here's the element. The element in this case would be oxygen, and when we find oxygen free in the atmosphere, the majority of it is in this what we call molecular oxygen. So even though this is a single element, there's 2 different atoms of it connected together. These are all different. Notice they're connected together, but they're different elements. That makes these 3, methane, ammonia, and water, compounds. Compounds are where you have different elements bound together with strong bonds, in this case covalent bonds. This one is not a compound, even though it's a molecule. So these are all molecules. These 3 are compounds. This is just simply a molecular form of the element. All right, so those are the structures that we can make, and this is the kind of thing that our metabolism is based on. In particular, what we're going to do, what we're going to see, is that we can take these structures and break them into pieces and rearrange them into different things. And those different things, like for example, I can take this methane and rearrange it into water and CO2. And if I do that, then the total amount of energy that I end up with is less than the total amount of energy that I started with. And that's going to allow me to release energy and use it for various metabolic purposes if my metabolism is based on this compound. Before we get to that, though, there's one other key issue. And as I mentioned earlier in the previous video, we were trying to figure out why is that water so important? Why is this molecule so important? It has to do with the relative ability of these 2 compounds, oxygen and hydrogen, to absorb electron density. Okay, let's go back a little bit and let's look at what these things actually look like. In this particular case, we're looking at something like hydrogen. There's a hydrogen atom, the dot is the nucleus, and the electron sphere is represented as kind of, spherical, kind of translucent thing. And we bind together like this when the 2 nuclei are similar in their ability to absorb electron density. We measure that by what's called electronegativity. The electronegativity of an atom is its ability to absorb electron density, roughly speaking. That's not the technical definition, of course. But if we're looking at this carefully, and we look at hydrogen, the electron density is evenly split between the two nuclei, just as it was shown in this picture here, like that. Water's different. If you look at oxygen, oxygen has a much higher electronegativity than hydrogen, meaning it can pull the electron density towards it in a much greater way than the single proton of the hydrogen can pull out. And so what happens then is the electron density gets to be pulled tightly towards the oxygen, which leaves this proton partially exposed, which means that on this end of the molecule, we get a slight negative charge. And on this end of the molecule, we get a slight positive charge. So towards the hydrogen, we have a positive. Towards the oxygen, we have a negative. This type of bond is still covalent, but it's what we call a polar covalent bond. It's polar because there's a negative pole and a positive pole. This one, between the two hydrogens, is nonpolar because they're equal. They're absolutely equal. There's nothing that says that this hydrogen is different than this hydrogen. Here, there is something. The oxygen is different because it has a negative charge, and the hydrogen is different because it has a positive. So notice that happens on both of these. This oxygen absorbs the electron density from both of these atoms, and so you get two positive charges on either side of the molecule and only one negative charge here. Okay, so that makes water really special. That makes it very, very different than other types of things, like, for example, gasoline. And the reason it does is because that positive charge on the hydrogen will be attracted to the negative charge on the oxygen, and you'll get a slight interaction. It's an electrostatic interaction that'll cause the hydrogen to be pulled towards that oxygen. And that forms a bond. It's not a strong bond, it's a weak bond. In fact, it's represented as a weak bond by this. This symbol right here is a lowercase Greek letter delta. Now, if you remember from your chemistry class, the delta, the triangle, represents change in, or something along those lines. This represents small change, which means this is a slight negative charge. It's not a full -1 or +1. It's just a slight difference in charge, but it's enough to form this electrostatic interaction, and you get a bond here, which is called a hydrogen bond. Now, don't get confused by that. Hydrogen bonds can form between things that have no hydrogen in them. That's historical. It was originally thought, when these were first discovered, that there was something sticky about the hydrogen, and that's why they referred to it as a hydrogen bond. It was later discovered that actually these hydrogen bonds arise because you have these polar covalent bonds, and it has nothing to do with hydrogen per se. It has to do with the existence of these slight positive negative charges. But this makes water what we call a polar solvent. Things will dissolve in water that themselves have a charge, because what will happen then is that these charges will dissolve around the structure that has the charge on it. So, for example, sodium chloride. Remember, we said if you put sodium chloride in water, the sodium and the chloride will separate. The sodium will give up an electron, become positively charged, and therefore a bunch of water molecules with all these oxygens pointing toward it are going to be attracted, because the negative charges of the oxygen are attracted to the positive charge of the sodium. And so the sodium gets completely surrounded with this water. We call it a hydration shell. And the chloride, same thing, but in this case, the chloride has gained an electron, so it becomes negatively charged, and therefore it pulls together all of these hydrogens, and it gets its own hydration shell with all the hydrogens pointing at it. So those types of things are absolutely strictly critical in a polar solvent. Anything with a charge will go into solution in that solvent. Same thing with sugar. Sugar has on it polar covalent bonds, again, between hydrogen and oxygen, and that sets up the ability of these water molecules to completely surround the sugar molecules. So when you put sugar in your coffee and stir it up, the sugar literally looks like it disappears. That's because every single molecule in those crystals that you put in, those white flaky crystals, will be completely separated from all the other molecules of sugar and get surrounded by water. So here's the point. Things that are polar will go into solution in water. Things that are ionic will go into solution in water. Another way of saying it is, more simply, anything with a charge will go into solution in water. But things without a charge won't. We'll get to that in a moment. But take a look at this. You see this? This is a water-striding spider, and it's standing on water, literally standing on water. What's holding this spider up off the water? These hydrogen bonds are. The spider is so light and has such a big surface area that it can use the strength of these little bonds to hold its body up out of the water. It can literally walk on the water. So the point is, each one of these individual bonds is weak, but together they can actually be quite strong. Now, that's not really that important for us in terms of our metabolism. We'll see why they're more important here in a moment. But before I get into that, I just want to get back to what I was saying before. Things that are polar or ionic, things that have a charge, go in solution in water. Things that are nonpolar don't go into solution in water. Let me give you an example here. Here, what we've got is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 carbon atoms, and every other open space on the carbons are filled with hydrogen. So this is what we call a hydrocarbon. And this is a particular hydrocarbon that you know extremely well. This is, because it has 8 carbons in it, the hydrocarbon octane. You call it gasoline. So if we take gasoline and put it into water, something interesting happens, because the carbon and the hydrogen have almost exactly the same electronegativity. So therefore, the electron densities on every single bond on these molecules is equal. There's no charge. So if you put that in water, you get this. The water will bond to itself through those hydrogen bonds, but it will not bond at all to the octane. It won't bond at all to the gasoline. So the gasoline will not go into solution in water. Anything that's nonpolar, therefore, will not go into solution in water, which is why, for example, if you take vegetable oil, in fact, you can try this at home. Take vegetable oil, put it into a glass of water, shake it up, and the oil will form these big droplets. It'll never go into solution. And that's why the oil has no polar covalent bonds anywhere, and therefore it won't go into solution in water at all. So that's why this becomes important. Somehow, the biomolecules of life have evolved to function in water. Okay? And that's now the third point that the NASA working group has actually come up with about their description, what they think is fundamentally important about living things on Earth. First is it's cellular, second is it's chemical, and they use covalent bonding properties of these things, and all of that metabolism has evolved to work in water. So why water? Why not something else? Why couldn't it be something else? Well, let me be clear. It's not that NASA is saying that it can't be something else. It's just that we would be kind of surprised if it was. For example, Europa appears to have water. Underneath its surface of ice, it has water. Europa is a moon of Jupiter. So everywhere where we see water on Earth, we have life. So we're thinking maybe there might be some life on Europa. But there's a moon of Saturn called Titan. And Titan has lakes and rivers and oceans, but they're not water. The lakes and rivers and oceans on Titan are hydrocarbons. They're like this, or like gasoline. And so these things then probably are not going to be harboring life, or if they do, we'd be surprised, and we may have some difficulty actually describing it and understanding it. Why? Well, because so much of what we understand about life is based on the polar solvent water. Here's an example. Somebody was asking a NASA Ames researcher, this gentleman here, why is water so important? And he answered in a way that was kind of convoluted, but let me just read it and we'll talk about it and think about it for a moment. He says, well, the solvent, in this case the water, has to promote self-organization of organic material into functional structures. They're mostly based on non-covalent interactions like hydrogen bonds. Now notice what he's saying. He's not saying that the metabolism is based on non-covalent bonds. He's saying that the functional structures are based on non-covalent bonds. And the hydrophobic interactions, and that's what these are, hydrophobic interactions are why the gasoline sort of sticks together. They're responsible for self-organizing phenomena in biological systems. Now let me be clear on what this is going to do. This, notice, is an organization. We get a droplet that is surrounded by water. And in fact, it's the water that's kind of holding this droplet together. And we call these interactions between the gasoline molecules hydrophobic interactions because they're sort of bonding together because of that. But really, they're being pushed together by the water. Membranes, we're going to find out, are organized because part of their molecule is like the gasoline. It does not go in solution in water, but another part does. And that organizes, that lines up the membrane so that the membrane forms a flat sheet. And that automatically happens. We don't need any metabolic structure. We don't need any metabolic construction machinery to put that together. It happens just by putting this type of soap molecule, which you call phospholipid, into water and you get membranes. It happens automatically. That's what he's getting at here. But there's another thing here, this protein folding. Protein folding is critical. What we're going to see is that the shape of proteins, and I'll describe what a protein is in the next lecture, the shape of the protein determines its function. So what determines the shape of a protein? Well, we're going to talk a lot about this in this class. We're going to talk a lot about proteins in this class. The reason is that proteins are really important. Proteins are absolutely critical in living things. DNA gets a lot of press and all of that, and it's great stuff. And don't get me wrong, DNA is important. But the reason why DNA is important is because it determines the proteins in the cell. It's the proteins that do everything. The proteins are the star. They determine everything. They determine how your cells function. They determine the shapes of the cells. They determine what the cell can and cannot do. They determine all the stuff about your body. Literally, and this is no exaggeration, if you gave a scientist complete control over your proteins, that scientist could change you into a Tyrannosaurus Rex. Because that's the only difference between you and a Tyrannosaurus Rex, is the proteins that are in those two different organisms. So the proteins are critical, and the shapes of the proteins are critical. The shapes determine what the protein's function actually is. So that's why we focus on it so much. So what determines the shape of a protein? The shapes of proteins are determined by an interaction between their very, very detailed structure, which is the sequence of the pieces out of which they're built. We'll learn later that those pieces are amino acids. The amino acids in that structure of the protein then interact with the water that they're in. And that water then takes that protein and folds it into a functional shape. Now we're going to study this in great detail, but that functional shape is what determines what the protein can do. That's why we call it a functional shape. So it's the water. Now the thing is, if you take that exact same protein and put it into something that's a nonpolar solvent that's not water, say for example you put it in a bunch of gasoline, it's not going to fold. It won't fold that way. It'll fold in a different way. In fact, it may not fold at all and won't be as stable. The water will fold it, stabilize it, and allow it to function in the way it's supposed to function. So here's the point. If we go to another planet and we start looking for life, we're going to be looking for life that's based on proteins. Proteins function because they exist in water. They function when they're in water. If you put them in something else, they won't function, which is why it is that we focus on water. That's one of the key reasons why we focus on water. So could there be life on another planet like the moon of Saturn, Titan, and have not a polar solvent be its basis? Yes, it's possible. But if that were true, it probably would be something that would be extremely difficult for us to recognize. And even if we did, it would be extremely different and almost impossible for us to really even say what it's doing. It would take an enormous amount of study because it would be so wildly different than everything that we've seen that's alive so far in our existence. So when we go to other planets, we should look for water. And that's exactly what we're doing. When we go to Mars, we look for water on Mars. And that's precisely what we've done. So early in the Mars exploration program, one of the sorts of mottos was follow the water. Find the water first. If you find water, then there's a chance for life. And we're past that now in the Mars exploration program, not necessarily in other places in the solar system like Europa, but we are certainly past that on Mars. And that's because we found water. So here's the thing. If we look, what's the evidence that there's water on Mars? Well, look, there's ice right there. Well, yeah, that's tricky though. Remember, like I said, that ice is not water ice. That's dry ice. Mostly what you see, all that white, is primarily CO2, frozen CO2. It literally snows carbon dioxide in the poles on Mars. But there's other evidence. We found mineral evidence. There's evidence on the surface of the planet, and they were found by the rovers Spirit, Opportunity, and Curiosity. Those are the last three rovers that have actually been on Mars from NASA. They found evidence for water evaporated minerals. In other words, minerals that are dissolved in water that form as minerals on the surface when the water evaporates. They've also found, Pathfinder, which are the earlier rovers, found evidence of boulders that look like they'd been worked in water. Now, if you go to the Salt River or any other major river, you'll see that they're a bunch of big cobbles and big sort of rounded stones. And that's because the water tends to break off all of the hard parts, all the little angular parts that stick off, and it smooths all those rocks and stones. We found things like that. We've also found hydrothermal deposits. Spirit has found hydrothermal deposits like, for example, this is an extreme example, but in Yellowstone. You get this really hot water that's coming up out of the ground, and it's carrying a bunch of minerals. That's the hydrothermal. And it then lands on the ground, and the water evaporates because it's very hot, and what's left over is all this mineral deposit, sort of like we saw before. We've also found ancient mud cracks. Opportunity found ancient mud cracks. And on the bottom of a lake, when the lake dries up and the mud then dries. It forms these very characteristic cracking patterns. And we found those on Mars as well, which indicates that in the past, there was standing water on the surface of Mars. There's not now. We've never found any standing water on Mars at all. But if we look in this mission, Mars Phoenix, which replaced another mission which is called Mars Polar Lander, and it became defunct when it became actually Mars Polar Crasher. Somebody didn't do the conversion right between English and metric, and the thing crashed into the surface of the planet. But this thing landed way up north, way close to the top. Right there, you see where that arrow is pointing. It's really close to the pole. In fact, it's just below all that white material. And it dug down in just a few centimeters, like 10 centimeters underneath the surface of the soil. It found water ice. So all of this is telling us that there was in the past water on Mars. There is currently water on Mars. And in the past, that water was liquid and flowing on its surface. But there's more. We also now have radar images from the orbiters. Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter found that there are large water deposits in the North Pole, and Mars Express, another orbiter, actually found that there's liquid water apparently under Mars' South Pole. So not only do we know that Mars has water, has a significant amount of water, we know that it flowed previously on the surface down below the poles, because that's where other landers found that evidence, but we also have liquid water essentially in the South Polar Cap anyway. So in the past, Mars could have looked like this. It could have had oceans. It could have had lakes, rivers, streams. And again, when I say a significant amount of water, I'm talking about a lot of water. Maybe not quite as much water as the Earth has. And the question then was, why did it change? What happened to all of that water, and why did it dry up and end up at the poles and all of this? That's being worked out now. But remember, Mars is considerably smaller than the Earth. It doesn't have as thick and as strong an atmosphere, so some of it gets lost to space. And the environment on Mars has changed considerably over time. So that also helps explain why it is that things are different. But when we talk about whether or not there's life on Mars, which is still an open question, don't get me wrong, we don't know whether there is or not, we are encouraged by the fact that it had water, flowing water, and we know that water is important in living systems because of the proteins, because of the self-organization that we had talked about before, which is why it is we desperately want to send people to Mars. If we can do that, we can find out whether or not really there is or was life on the surface, because people, as good as our rovers are, as excellent as they are, people are much more able to deal with evolving situations and changing situations. You don't have to program a human being to handle every possible thing you can conceive of. The reason why is because we can figure things out that somebody didn't conceive of. And missions always run into that. They always run into situations where something occurs that no one thought of ahead of time. And if you haven't programmed that onto your probe can't deal with it. But a human could, a person could. So, is there life on Mars? We don't know yet. Was there life on Mars? We don't know yet. It's still an open question. So that's why it is. I want you to study hard, become astronauts, and go to Mars and find out.